Good morning.
Good
Dr.
morning.
Johnson is here again with me on our series that we started called Conversations with Dr. Daniel Johnson, our medical director at the Anti-Fragility Health Clinic. So, Dr. Johnson, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I heard you slept well and you had some amazing dreams.
Helicopter dreams.
Dr. Johnson, you didn't crash it, did you?
Not at all.
Oh, wow. That's a good thing, because today I want you to use your piloting skills in discussing about the Boston Heart Diagnostics for blood.
Okay, where's the joystick so I can control this thing?
So we're going to start, because this is a very important diagnostic that we run here at the clinic, and it covers four main areas. We look at your lipids, we look at inflammation, we look at metabolics and genetics. So we're going to start. When we look at the lipids, when you are looking at a diagnostic report for a patient, what are some of the key biomarkers that will indicate to you this whole talk about cholesterol?
Well, the basics that any doctor is going to order is your total cholesterol,
Yes.
HDL, which is the good cholesterol, and we want higher readings rather than lower readings, LDL, which is the bad cholesterol, and there we want lower readings, not higher readings. Along with that, the other fat in the bloodstream is called triglycerides. So those are the basics. Now, what Boston Heart Lab does is they break it down dramatically into its much smaller component pieces. For example, you could have a high LDL, which is the bad cholesterol, but they measure something called particle size. The big particles are relatively harmless. The small or tiny particles are much more dangerous. So they give us a reading on something called the small dense LDL, which is the really the bad stuff.
Yes. And so, but there's been some emerging biomarkers that are more indicative of
Yes.
the underlying cardiovascular risk, rather
Yes.
than just looking at those
Yes.
lipid or cholesterol. And what are those emerging biomarkers that you look at also?
Well, there are several here,
Yes.
and this is quite frankly, this is quite cutting edge, to the point that I am still somewhat in the learning process.
Yeah.
Where's the one I'm looking for here?
Yeah, I thought it was at the beginning, sorry. I was looking at the summary, the LPA, the
Yeah.
APO.
Yeah. Okay. So there's something called APO, which is a part of your LDL. I mentioned a moment ago the small dense LDL, which is the really bad stuff. And then there's a marker called Lp(a), which is lipoprotein A. This is such a new test that most mainstream doctors don't even do the test. And if they do the test kind of almost by accident, they'll look at the results and not be sure what to do with it.
Yeah.
Lp(a) is something that we inherit a genetic tendency to have a low or safe LDL or have a high dangerous Lp(a).
Yeah.
And unfortunately, if somebody has a high Lp(a) and a doctor prescribes a statin for their cholesterol, that's going to make the Lp(a) worse. And Lp(a) is the last marker that you ever want to make worse.
And that is a very important point that we want to emphasize. So if you do not know that and you are prescribed a statin, that's actually going to make that inherited genetic risk worse.
Exactly. And it will dramatically increase your risk of a heart attack or a stroke.
Yeah.
Now, I'm personally not a fan of statins, and there's another reason for that, is that statins are actually toxic to our mitochondria, the power plants in our cells. And the heart is one organ in the body that really relies on many more mitochondria than the average cell does. So why on earth would you take something that's toxic to the mitochondria in your
So
heart?
if you're not a fan of statins, and statins are being prescribed all the time for a lot of our friends and customers, what are you a friend for people who have cholesterol issues on their lipid biomarkers?
Are you saying that statins
Can you finish the answer? No, you can't do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's something called red yeast rice, which people can take.
Yes.
Now that's actually a distant relative of statins, but it is much, much safer. There is an herb called berberine that's helpful. The vitamin niacin
Yes.
is helpful. And there's an herb called bergamot, which is
And when you were talking to me about the niacin, you said that there was, we have a slow release, but you wanted the fast release
Yes.
niacin.
Yes.
That is a much better. And why is that? Because a lot of people out there are taking niacin.
Yeah. Well, it's simply because the research has shown
Yeah.
that the slow release niacin doesn't work like the fast release does.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. There was a question Karen had.
Yeah, I had a question, and then there's a question online.
Louder.
I have a question, and there's a question online. My question is, so doctors are prescribing statins, and statins are have a tendency to cause you to have a higher risk of a stroke or a heart attack. So
Well,
why is it being
For
prescribed?
people who have high LPAs.
If a person doesn't have a problem with a high Lp(a), then that's not relevant to them. But for people who start out with a high Lp(a), the statin is going to make it worse.
Yes.
And it is not routine for mainstream doctors to test for Lp(a), so they just don't know in a given patient if that risk factor is present. Now, there's one more thing that sounds completely insane, even to me, but I recently read a study that concluded that people who eat one Brazil nut per month will significantly lower their cholesterol.
Wow.
Now, why one a month? Why not one a week? Why not one a day?
Because perhaps they're expensive.
No, they're not.
They're only for helicopter drivers. Right. You had a second question. And how do we get this?
Brazil
you call them
nuts?
Brazil nuts.
You go to the grocery store.
Can you order some for us? Some
Whole
Brazil
foods.
nuts. We
Yeah.
should have it here.
Absolutely.
Right. And we should feed it. Can you take too much Brazil nuts?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I mean,
And what about walnuts?
well, walnuts are very good for other reasons.
Yes.
Hilarious.
All right.
Yeah.
So what was your second
The
question?
second question was, are these types of diagnostics given in Western medication, in Western hospitals?
Yes, traditionally it is. The Boston Heart Diagnostic, it's okay. The Boston Heart Diagnostic is available in most places, but the question is that most doctors, as Dr. Johnson was just saying, would not prescribe it because it's a much more expensive test. We do it here because we are prevention oriented
Yes, absolutely.
rather than treating your disease after you had a heart attack. Typically, if you have had a heart attack or a stroke, then they will run it. Here we do it to prevent, right? So we are focused on prevention. It's very important.
Yes.
So let's move to the next topic of things that we measure here, which is the inflammation markers. So Dr. Johnson, why is measuring inflammation markers very important?
Well, because inflammation in the walls of arteries is one of the major causes of hardening and clogging of the arteries. And so if you've got hardened or clogged arteries, which most people past the age of 50 or so do, then you want to improve their arteries on one hand, and on the other you want to identify the risk factors that cause the problem so we can neutralize them. And inflammation is very high on the list of risk factors. I consider it to be more important than cholesterol.
All right, so very important point. And what are some of those markers for inflammation?
Well, there's something called CRP, which stands for C-reactive protein, which
Yeah.
probably doesn't mean anything to most people, but
Yeah.
there's one version of that test that looks for inflammation anywhere in your body, but there's a cardiac CRP, which is the one we're talking about here,
Yes.
that specifically measures inflammation in the walls of arteries.
Okay.
And with that particular test, we want the reading to be as low as possible. We want a reading of less than 1.
Okay.
Yesterday, I had a patient that had a CRP of 42.
Wow.
And before I learned more about the patient, I said to the nurse, I said, this patient must have some additional source of inflammation. And it turns out that he has rheumatoid arthritis.
Wow.
So Other sources of inflammation in certain cases can spill over and show up as part of that CRP reading.
Interesting.
Okay.
Very interesting. So inflammation, and then I know sometimes you also look at fibrinogen.
Yes.
But the CRP is the big one.
Yes.
So now let's look at what we call metabolics.
Okay.
The whole sugar metabolism.
Yes.
So talk to us, because typically we are looking at glucose and HbA1c, which are important markers.
Yes.
For how you're metabolizing sugar, how efficient your body is in taking sugar and quickly absorbing that sugar so the sugar doesn't stay in the blood.
Yes.
Right, that's the
Yes.
very important underlying biochemistry.
Yes, absolutely. So your sugar in your bloodstream cannot get into your cells. In your cells is where it will be burned to produce energy, and that's a good thing, of course. But the sugar cannot get into the cells until the hormone insulin unlocks the door and opens it for the sugar, okay? So with Americans, with our modern sedentary lifestyle and our horrible diet that's full of sugars and starches, blood sugar tends to run on the high side in a lot of people. And so the higher your blood sugar is, the more insulin your body will produce to help that extra sugar get into the cells. Unfortunately, when that condition continues, your cells start to become resistant to the effects of insulin. So what does your body do? It makes more insulin, which means your cells become more resistant. We want our cells to be sensitive to insulin. And so insulin sensitivity is a very good thing. But the more sugar we eat, the more we develop insulin resistance.
Yes.
Insulin resistance is the first step on the way to pre-diabetes, which then usually progresses to full-blown diabetes.
Yeah.
And what do diabetic patients die from? They die from heart attacks and strokes in most cases.
Yes.
Why? Because insulin resistance is a huge risk factor for hardening and clogging of the arteries.
Correct. See the relationship. It's really important that we connect the relationship between the metabolics and the cholesterol so that people have a very strong and powerful understanding around the relationships around your blood sugar and the relationship it has for the clogging and hardening of arteries.
Yes.
So it's important that you do your diagnostics, and that these diagnostics are critical initiators or baseline for you to pursue a prevention or a reversal strategy. A reversal strategy, as we practice in the clinic, are for people who already have the diagnosis for disease.
Yes.
And prevention are for people who may have a family risk or really want to stay healthy and live a very long life. So thank you again, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, can I add one more thing?
Go ahead, Dr.
Okay.
Johnson.
It is considered that every human on the planet is potentially pre-diabetic or diabetic.
Yeah.
As we age, a significant part of the aging process is that we tend to develop more and more insulin resistance.
Yeah.
So, if you're past the age of 50 or so, it becomes especially important to pay attention to this if you plan on living a long, healthy life.
Yeah.
Which I think most of us would prefer a long, healthy life rather than a short, sick one.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you, Dr. Johnson.
My pleasure.
Another great conversation with Dr. Johnson. Thank you for joining, and we hope that you will call us to run this very important baseline diagnostics. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you.